Hi, I'm Kristen Ludlow from NBA Inside Stuff, and you're listening to the Double Clutch Podcast.
Hello there, guys, and welcome to the latest edition of the Double Clutch Podcast. I'm Joe Hulbert, one of you, your host, and I'm joined today by a special guest. I'm joined by one of NBA Twitter's finest, someone I've followed for a long time, Jackson Frank. How are you doing, Jackson?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, yeah. I'm not going to lie, I kind of need basketball back. People on my timeline are arguing about like Ryan Anderson at the moment, so I'm sure you've seen that as well.
We're getting to the doldrums of the NBA offseason. We're recycling a lot of arguments that we had in July, so I will very much welcome basketball back in about a month.
Oh, we need it, yeah. I don't want to hear about Ryan Anderson again. And we're not here to talk about Ryan Anderson, so we'll talk about you. So you write for a lot of sites. Two teams you cover, the Sixers and the Nuggets. Jackson is a Portland Trailblazers fan. That's who we're going to talk about today. Do you find it kind of hard writing about other teams, or do you sort of find it easy?
I think I find it easier because I think I'm able to take a more objective approach to things. Obviously, there's still a lot of bias and whatnot. I mean, if you're writing a column, you're going to have an opinion about things, but I find it somewhat easier, especially because those are two teams I've still followed fairly closely over the last, whenever I started following the NBA since I was 12 or 13, pretty closely. Especially the Nuggets, just because they're in the Blazers division. So I think it's a more enjoyable way for me because I don't have quite the vested interest in the team's success as I do if I were covering the Blazers, which might affect some of my writing more.
Yeah, I find out the Timberwolves sometimes. I'm trying to be objective about the offense, and I just want to go on a rant, and my editors are like, Joe, you can't say that. You gotta tone it down. But I mean, like me, you've had quite a quick rise through NBA Twitter. I remember when you started following me, I think you probably had about, not that followers mean anything, by the way, but I would say you've gained a couple of thousand followers since I started following you. How is it? What sort of journey has it been for you as a writer? Because I know you write for your college paper as well.
Yeah. I'd say the first time I ever really started writing about the NBA was June of 2017. I joined on it at Sixer Sense at Fansided and wrote for them for a few months. And then did a little bit of work with a couple SB Nation NBA team sites, and then obviously we both were at Def Pen for a bit. I'm not there anymore, but I wrote some columns for them for about a month, and then so it kind of exploded after that. I really liked the idea of writing columns on a consistent basis. I had people who were starting to read my stuff and give me feedback, but it really took off. I'd say probably sometime around this summer, I got pretty invested in a lot of draft work with prospects and whatnot. And I've also been lucky. A lot of people have given me shout outs on Twitter and said he's someone to follow. So I can't say it's just all the work I've done. I've had a lot of people be complimentary of the work I produce, and a lot of people with big followings that are recommending people to follow me, which is nice. But yeah, it has been kind of weird just because for a while I was just someone with 300, 400 followers and posting my takes and not getting a lot of interaction, and now I can't post, not that it's bad, but I don't post one opinion without at least 2 or 3 replies, which is awesome because I like talking basketball, and the more people that are either going to affirm or push back on my ideas is something that I really enjoy.
Yeah, it's a great community, very supportive bunch of people, I think. I certainly find it that way. But so you cover the Nuggets and the Sixers, but I kind of want you to be a fan today. That's why I do this podcast. So we got you on to talk about the Portland Trailblazers. This might weird you out. There's a lot of Blazers fans in the UK. I've never really known why, because I think a lot of it is because you've been quite fun in the last couple of years. You've had a lot of sort of, I mean, we only get the highlights over here on our TV. Yeah. A lot of them is like, with Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum stuff. But we do have a couple of Blazers fans on our roster. But we'll start with last season. So I found you quite a weird team last year. I expected you to be a high-powered offense with a bad defense. You were kind of the opposite. You had a top 10 defense. Your offense was, I've written subpar here. Maybe I'm being a little bit harsh, but it was 16th in efficiency. Did this surprise you? Because it surprised me, and I think it surprised a lot of neutrals as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it was a bit surprising. As you said, they've generally been a much better offensive team than defensive team. I think a lot of that change stemmed from one, their pick and roll defense was awesome. Yusuf Nurkic has his limitations, but they dropped him back and let him be a rim protector, and he was pretty dang good defending at the rim. And Damian Lillard was just a lot better as an on-ball defender this year. He kind of slipped towards the end of the year. He was dealing with some ankle issues. But for the majority of the year, he was a lot better at getting around screens. He was a lot more aggressive. He had a tendency to just kind of die on them the first 6 years of his career, maybe every year before this, I should say. So he was a lot better there. And Al-Farouq Aminu is an awesome defender. He's probably one of the best defenders that most people don't know about. But it was surprising. I think part of it had to do with McCollum had a little bit of a down year, and those guys, he and Lillard just have such a big offensive burden that his slip was really hurt their offensive efficiency, especially without Lillard on the floor for stretches.
Yeah, when I watched you a couple of times, because obviously our teams meet quite often, your offense was very, what's the word? Streaky is probably the word I'd like to use. You had spells where you were like cut. I'm only talking about Timberwolves games here. You had spells you were cutting us to pieces. You had other spells where like nothing was happening. And part of being an NBA writer is reading a lot. So I read a lot of lots of articles, but I interact with normal fans. And an idea that has come up quite often is actually something that, so Mike Miller, not the former Miami Heat wing, we have someone on our roster called Mike Miller. He has said that, among other things, that he believes a lot of teams have started to figure out this Trailblazers offense. It's not an offense really based on ball movement at 28th in passes last year. Do you kind of see it that way? Because, I mean, I'm not saying Stotts hasn't changed things. This is someone else I want to hear from you. But do you think there's an argument to suggest that teams have maybe figured the Blazers out a little bit?
I think a little bit, and I think part of the issue is that Yusuf Nurkic just isn't a very dynamic piece offensively, but they want to keep him engaged because they need his rebounding and his rim protection, and so they worry that if they don't get him some touches, I'm just speculating. Obviously, I don't have a connection with the team, but I think part of it is they just want to get him touches, and so he can't do a ton out of the pick and roll. He's not a great passer on the short roll. He's not a very dynamic finisher around the rim. He's not a very good post player, and so when they have to sacrifice 8 or 9 touches a game to him, that really can hurt their efficiency. And I would agree that it's a lot more player movement, especially when Dame and CJ play off the ball. They're doing a lot of stuff. They're moving around a lot of screens and whatnot. But it's largely just a ball handler at the top of the key, waiting for those sets to kind of develop. So I think that's a pretty fair assessment. But I do think getting Yusuf Nurkic touches is a pretty big piece there, because it's important, because you don't want him to kind of check out defensively because you need him there. But he just doesn't offer a lot of offensive value as a scorer. But I think one thing I noticed last year, and I admittedly didn't watch as many games. I watched a fair amount of Blazers, obviously, but definitely not as many as I had in previous years, because I was watching more of the NBA at large. But when they traded for him, they seemed to use him a fair amount at the high post. He's a pretty good elbow passer on cuts and whatnot, and they didn't really seem to utilize him as much there. And so I think if there's a way to get him involved without sacrificing a ton of offensive efficiency, I think it might be running some cuts and whatnot with him facilitating the high post, because he's a pretty solid passer from there. So I'd like to see that, but I think like you said, it's definitely a lot more player movement and a little bit of stagnation with the ball.
And the question I've got for you on Nurkic is, you've spoken about his defensive impact there. Do you think it's kind of worth it? Do you think Nurkic is valuable enough on defense that you kind of have to give him those positions? What I'm trying to get at here is, do you think long term that is a great plan? Do you think it's going to be detrimental long term, giving Nurkic these touches and as good? Do you see that value as positive as other people do?
Yeah, maybe not long term, but he's historically kind of been a little bit of a, for lack of a better term, temperamental. Not that I'm using that in a bad way, but he's been a guy who kind of needs to be involved to stay engaged. He had some games last year where Zach Collins played over him down the stretch, and there was maybe a little bit of rumblings in the locker room that it didn't set well with him. I don't know if that was necessarily the case, but I think in the short term, I don't think it's a terrible idea, because one, they don't really have a better option right now, big men. Zach Collins is he's kind of a limited rotation guy right now. And so I think they need him to be productive at the 5 spot. But yeah, long term, I think it's an interesting question just because he isn't a super dynamic and valuable offensive piece. You have to wonder there. But I do think he was a pretty important part of why their defense was good. So I would lean towards right now with the roster they have in place, I think it's worth it. But if one of their younger guys like Collins or Caleb Swanigan starts to show some promise as maybe like a 5th starter or something, then maybe you reevaluate. But for now, I think it's worth it just because there are games where he has it clicking on both ends of the floor and he drops 30 and 16 and is just cooking in the pick and roll with Lillard and McCollum. So right now I don't have an issue with it, but I do think it shouldn't be a set in stone thing and just ignore any context around it.
Yeah, he's been a very valuable pickup, and part of the reason for that is that you've got these sort of 2 young big men who many don't think are quite ready, and that's why when a lot of people look at the Blazers last year, so this is sort of going into my next question. You were the 3 seed, and I know you lost in the first round. Sorry to bring that up, but
it's all right.
It's all right. We did as well. It happens, but but a lot of people don't see you as that sort of true 3 seed. You so Minnesota had injuries, and you were I think you were only a couple of games ahead of the 8 seed. Do you and other Blazers fans see it that way? So because ultimately, if you go back, Neil Olshey could easily come out in an interview and say we were the 3 seed. That was a good season. But do you see it that way, or do you sort of see that it's a 3 seed with a massive asterisk on the end?
Yeah, I'd say there's a happy medium there. I don't like the idea that they kind of lucked into. I think they definitely did benefit from some injuries, but you can only play who's in front of you, and you can only control what your schedule and whatnot. And so I do think that maybe they benefited. I don't like to use the term luck because they still had to win 49 games, winning nearly 50 in the West, with really only 2 All-Star caliber guys is still really impressive. But I do see that. I do see that going forward, there's some concerns because they were so healthy injury wise. Whereas a lot of teams, like you said, the Timberwolves missed Jimmy Butler for a while. Andre Roberson went down to the Thunder. The list goes on and on with key injuries to guys. So I do think there should be some reason for concern coming into the year, especially because like you said, they only made the playoffs by I think 3 games. I think the Nuggets had 46 wins, the Blazers had 49. So I do think there's some reason for concern coming up this season, but I think what they did was a very honest and fair season. Obviously, it would have been nice to make the second round, especially as a 3 seed with home court advantage. But I look at it more as there's reasons for concern going forward rather than looking backward.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. You're right. I mean, people forget how tough the West is. It's not like you lucked into the 3 seed in the East, did it in the West. But you touched there on sort of Stotts and Olshey and how certainly I think I definitely get a sense from you that you you have a lot of praise for the job Terry Stotts has done. But that first round series, again, sorry to bring it up, but we have to talk about it. What do you think the main thing was the limitations of the roster? Do you think there was a coaching problem? Do you think there was a bit of both? I mean, I know obviously Anthony Davis just destroyed you, but sort of I'm trying to look at this from a Terry Stotts point of view. Does he hold any blame for that series, or do you think this is more he was just working with what he's got and he had no answer given to him by Olshey for a guy like Anthony Davis?
Yeah, I think it's mostly the limitations of the roster. I do think Stotts deserves some blame. Alvin Gentry definitely outcoached him in that series. He wasn't really able to adapt to the Pelicans had a very aggressive pick and roll trapping scheme, and he didn't really seem to find a way to counteract that. I wrote a piece about that back in April, and I found some things that worked, and it didn't seem like Stotts did a ton to try and explore that more. A lot more player movement and some double screen out, stagger screen, some Spain pick and rolls seemed to be more successful than just the high screen and roll that they kept running with Lillard. So I do think he shoulders some blame, but a lot of it was just one, Nurkic can't really defend in space very well, and so when you put Anthony Davis at the 5, he's just going to feast on there. He's going to play far out and then use his speed and quickness to beat Nurkic, and two, just the Pelicans left all the Blazers 3-point shooters open, and they just couldn't hit him for whatever reason. And I think Alfred Camino is pretty good, but beyond him, the numbers are pretty bad. And so I think Stotts deserves some blame, but it's definitely not primarily on him. It was just a bad matchup. Lillard wasn't fully healthy. He sprained his ankle, I think, maybe with 4 or 5 games to go in the regular season, and you could just tell he wasn't quite healthy. Obviously, Drew Holiday did a fantastic job defending him, and that's the main reason. But you could tell he just wasn't getting quite the same lift and explosion as a playmaker. So I think it was just a bad recipe, not a recipe for success. But I do think he was a little more rigid as a coach than you'd like to see in terms of his adaptability.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like Gentry was a little bit more creative in the series. I mean, Gentry has not really got the highest reputation as a head coach, but I think offensively, certainly he will stay aggressive in those series. But moving on from Stotts last season, one of the things I've seen certainly on Trailblazers Twitter, and actually from just the Blaze fans I speak to, there's this sort of Stotts Olshey. I wouldn't call it a rivalry, but fans seem to be sort of picking sides. Now I know you're not really a guy who likes to do that, but I remember a couple of years ago when you shocked everyone by making the playoffs. After Aldridge had gone, everyone was talking about Stotts Olshey as like one of the top 5 coach GM combos. But you've got to look at this roster Olshey has put together. The Evan Turner contracts, the sort of, I mean, even your recent offseason, Nick Stauskas and Seth Curry's okay, but Nick Stauskas, that's just that's weird to me. Where do you see this relationship going? And kind of who do you prefer, or do you think they're sort of a package deal?
Yeah, I have no issue saying I heavily favor Stotts at this point. I think what he's done with the roster put around him the last 3 or 4 years has been very impressive. He's a guy who's generally seemed to maximize the talent he has, and I would agree. I think the narrative around Olshey has really shifted the last 3 or 4 years. Especially, I mean, he was definitely regarded well when they made the playoffs with some of the moves he made after losing Aldridge. But that summer of 2016 it's just the signings there just don't make a ton of sense. They seem to kind of be bidding against themselves, and they've really capped what they can do around their 2 stars in McCollum and Lillard. And so I worry that I think Stotts might be the scapegoat here, which would be frustrating. But I've sort of kind of prepared for that at some point. If some things don't go well this year, I could see him getting fired. Unfortunately, I don't think it would be justified. I think he's a really good coach. I think because there are so many other good coaches in the NBA nowadays, he's not a top 5 guy. He's probably more of a fringe top 10, maybe the 10 to 12 range. But that's more a testament to the quality of coaches above him than anything he's done. So I hope that Stotts gets a little more leeway, and the organization recognizes that he doesn't have a ton of resources to use. I am very much frustrated with the things Olshey has done. He seems to kind of preach things that he thinks the fans will like to hear. Last summer when they traded Alan Crabb and they got that trade exception, they propped up as a really nice tool and resource, and it came and went and expired this summer, and they did nothing with it. They talk a lot about. He said that you can't really get good players or win now players at the 38th pick, and history shows that's not the case, or at least recently. There was a huge need for wing depth this year, and they really didn't do anything to address that, both in the offseason or in the draft. And there were certainly pieces to be had in the draft, especially there. I understand the guard thing. They want to have shooting. They want to have a lot of ball handlers. They lost Napier, and he was a pretty big piece. And so bringing in 2 guards who can shoot the ball and Stauskas and Curry makes sense in theory. But Nick Stauskas just isn't a very good player, and that's not a knock on him. I don't have anything against him. He just hasn't proven to be a really impactful player in his career. So I think this year was kind of the icing on the cake with not using the trade exception, not getting wing depth, and kind of just saying what he thinks the fans want to hear, and kind of contradicting what he said in years past. So nothing against Neil Olshey as a person. I've just been very frustrated with what he's done as a GM the last two years or so.
Yeah, that comment he made about the 38th pick, when I heard that, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was just absolute nonsense, honestly. He has introduced a couple of big men through the draft, so that's who we're going to move on to next. So you mentioned a minute ago, you've got Jusuf Nurkic's limitation in space. Personally, I think one of the big problems the Blazers have is that I don't think they've got any what I call dynamic front court players at the moment. I don't think there's anyone you would give sort of a big offensive load to. Guys who have multiple skills you can put into a set. But what do you make of Zach Collins and sort of Caleb Swanigan? How good do you think they can be? Do you think their ceiling is sort of bit part rotational players, or do you see? So a lot of Zach Collins fans before the draft, they thought this guy could be sort of a very reliable stretch center who you could give all these touches to. Do you have hope for these guys?
Obviously, I definitely have a little bit of bias towards Collins. Obviously, I'm a Gonzaga guy, and so he's the same age as me. I watched him dominate off the bench in his freshman year, 2 years ago. But I like Collins. I think he got a lot better throughout the year. He kind of toiled away on the bench until about mid-December. I remember it was weird. He kind of just suddenly entered the rotation and against the Rockets in like December 10th or something out of the blue after not really playing much. I think he got a lot better. I'm really interested to see if, one, he's improved his three-point consistency. The mechanics are good. He's smooth. He's fluid as a shooter, but he only shot like 31%. And if he's bulked up enough, because he's got, or at least at Gonzaga, he showed a pretty fundamentally sound post game, but he just didn't have the strength to really do a lot in the NBA last year as a rookie. I thought one of the things that was really interesting with him is he showed some nice passing vision from the high post, finding some cutters and whatnot. So I was generally encouraged by Collins. He was such a raw guy coming out of Gonzaga, and so seeing that he was able to make an impact on a playoff team and kind of get in the rotation the second half of the year was definitely encouraging. Swanigan is he's kind of a different case. He's definitely a talented player, but he's just so undersized and so slow that I worry about his long-term impact. He's a bruiser. He's going to make an impact on the boards, but I just don't have a lot of hope for him overall. I just think he's too slow and too undersized to be a consistent rotation player, whereas I think Collins could be like the third or fourth best player on a playoff team at some point. I don't think it's going to be anytime in the next 2 or 3 years, or maybe not this year. I should say. I could see maybe in two years he could be a pretty vital piece as a starter. And I think a lot of it is just seeing and monitoring the development from year 1 to year 2 and seeing what strides he made.
You've spoken there about Zach Collins' offensive game. He could be this sort of stretch five. Having a stretch five is very valuable if used them properly. But on the defensive side, so let's say in 2 years Zach Collins is your five. What have you seen on the defensive side of the ball? Do you think he could shoulder that load as an inside defender, defending out in space, defending pick and roll? If people are going to target him, do you think he can hold his own?
Yeah, I do. I think the balance there is, one, he has to put on weight, obviously, but you want to make sure that if you put on muscle and weight, that you don't lose some of your quickness, because he's a pretty agile and nimble player for someone who's 7 feet or nearly 7 feet tall. He was a really good rim protector. I think the field goal percentage defended at the rim was pretty good for him last year. It was a fairly small sample size, but he was a good pick and roll defender, a good rim protector. Showed an ability to defend in space every now and then, and so I was generally pretty encouraged with his defense. The biggest thing is cutting down on the fouls. He was a pretty big foul guy as a rookie, which a lot of guys are. And he was that way at Gonzaga too. That was part of the reason he only played like 18 minutes a night, in addition to the insane depth they had that year. But I thought his defense was probably the most encouraging part of his game as a rookie. He showed a lot of nice flashes to be kind of a switchy rim protecting big in his prime. Now the hope is that he can provide consistent offensive value to the point where he's just not such a negative there that he's not worth playing.
You seem to be very hopeful for him. You're actually one of the more positive Blazers fans I've spoken to. They just seems to be quite a negative place at the moment. But we'll move on now to your sort of your more well-known players. So we're going to talk about your backcourt. Dame Lillard, CJ McCollum. So again, bringing up Mike Miller, my colleague, he has this belief that that core is kind of it's hit its heights already. There's not much they can do with the sort of cap room unless they somehow hit on another front court piece. What do you make of this moving forward? Obviously, I would imagine you want Lillard to stay. I can't imagine why anyone wanted to go. But I'm more looking at McCollum in this. Do you think trading him would have sort of any benefit, or do you want this core to stay together?
Yeah, I've talked a little bit about the idea of trading McCollum. Like you said, I'm very much. I don't want to trade Lillard. I think it'd be an awful move basketball wise, and from a fan perspective, I think it would alienate a lot of fans, especially because of how Lillard's embraced the city. But anyways, I think the theory of trading McCollum is a lot better than what you'd probably get back, just because the market isn't huge for a one-way undersized two guard who can't be a primary ball handler, and that's kind of putting him in a negative light. But tremendous scorer, fantastic shooter, but there's just not I don't think there's not a team that can provide fair value, and there's also not a team that probably wants him and can provide fair value. So I think the market for him is fairly limited, and I worry about getting a bunch of future pieces while Lillard's in his prime and you have all this money tied up. And so in theory, I support the idea of trading McCollum. I think getting a better front court player or a wing piece would be really useful for the Blazers. But I don't think there's a lot you can do by trying to stay relevant with Lillard in his prime and trading McCollum, just in terms of what's out there and what teams would be interested in trading for a guy like him. Philadelphia is a team that's been tossed around a lot. They could use a shot creator and a guy who can hit the three ball pretty well. But you just wonder if they're willing to part with a Saric or a Covington or a future asset. And I think he would be a really good fit there. They have the defensive pieces around him to kind of insulate him. But there's just not a huge market, like I've said, and so I worry that if they did trade him, they would get they wouldn't get fair value, and then Lillard would be stuck with a bunch of B-, C+ pieces while he's in his prime, and then that's how you win 33 games, and you're capped out. You're capped out both ceiling wise and salary wise.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on the side that I don't think you get value back. The thing that I question is, so if you're trading CJ McCollum, you're probably not going to get another shooting guard back who's going to help you win now. So you're looking at kind of a front court player. My question is does a sort of Lillard Saric combo, do you seriously win more games than you do with Lillard McCollum? Yeah, because that's the question I've always come back to. Like I love Saric. I think there's a very likely scenario where he is more valuable to an NBA team than McCollum because of McCollum's defense and the fact, there's that to think of. But do you really think there's anything you could get back and you win more games than McCollum?
Yeah, no, I think it's tough. I mean, McCollum is in a tough spot because he's not a terrible defender. He's a smart defender, but because he can't play the one offensively, he has to guard twos defensively, because you have to have a primary ball handler next to him, and he's just too undersized. I don't know if this might be an off-base take, but I think he might be a little bit better of a defender than Lillard, but because he has to defend twos, he's a worse defender, and that makes sense. But yeah, I don't think there's a lot you can get back. I think you'd be hoping for a dynamic pick and roll threat, and that's not really what Saric is. He's kind of a spot up shooter who can make some plays off the dribble, create for himself a little bit. And I don't know how much different that is from McCollum. I mean, they're different players, obviously, but in terms of kind of just a bird's eye view, I don't know how much different that impact would be. And so I think you'd be looking for either like a 3-and-D wing who can do a little more off the dribble than traditional 3-and-D wing, or a big man, but you just signed Nurkic for 4 more years. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges and hurdles that are presented when you try to think of a deal for McCollum. One that's been tossed around a little bit, just in group chats and maybe a little bit on Twitter, not very prominently, is McCollum to the Timberwolves for something around Wiggins. He seems like, I mean, McCollum could be a guy who would fit in well in Minnesota. I think I'm not a huge Wiggins guy, so I push back on that, but I think there's maybe a little bit of credence to it. There'd probably have to be some more pieces on Minnesota's end and see what goes on there, but that would be something that maybe intrigues a lot of people. It doesn't intrigue me, but I could see why people get behind it.
Yeah, it would intrigue me. I mean, I've kind of avoided talking about Andrew Wiggins on Twitter because you say anything positive and you get sort of angry looks. I think you spoke there about McCollum being a willing and intelligent defender. Correct me if I've misquoted you there. But Wiggins is the opposite. He's got the athletic ability to be a good defender. His problems, certainly from what I watched, they're all sort of they're mental lapses. He'll just see a cutter a second too late. But actually, if you get him one-on-one, he's actually quite a good defender.
Yeah, and he made strides this year. If I recall, he was definitely a better defender, both
he did
via the eye test and the metrics. But yeah, like you said, it's a lot more mental stuff with him.
He got a lot better at denying penetration to guards as well, which actually, I mean, it's quite depressing. He was actually one of our better defensive players, which says a lot about the state of the team. But I actually think someone like Stotts would be good for Wiggins. I think the problem Wiggins has had in Minnesota, and this is something that if you speak to sort of, Darren Wolfson, John Krasinski, they all say that Wiggins' is bad habit, because we were such a crap team for ages, his bad habits have just not been picked up on. He drifts out of games. So a change of scenery, honestly, is a good way. But again, I'm not sure Olshey would pull the trigger on that one. But it's one of the more reasonable ones I've seen. The one we used to see a lot was Kevin Love. I'm guessing you wanted no part of that.
Yeah, the Love for McCollum trade was kind of a trendy one. I don't know how much better Love makes the Blazers because of his injury history recently. He's not any better defensively, really. He's not as bad as maybe his reputation suggests, but he's not a plus there. So I just think, like you said, we've said, it's tough to find a lot of fair returns and ones that make sense that improve the Blazers in the short/long term.
Yeah, certainly a tough one to navigate for Olshey, but he has he's kind of made his own bed a bit. Your off season was pretty. I mean, I wouldn't call it an eventful one. You didn't have a high pick. You didn't do much for AJ, but you signed Seth Curry, you signed Nick Stauskas. You touched on it a little bit earlier. But again, my colleague Mike Miller, he really does not like the three guard setups that the Blazers sort of like to go with. What did you make of the off-season, even though it was quite uneventful?
Yeah, I think uneventful is the best word to use. A lot of teams in the West were able to either the cap space to sign guys, or they were able to say, well, look at this star/fringe star that's coming back, or this young piece we have that's going to develop. And the Blazers didn't really have either of those things. I don't mind the Seth Curry signing. He's a pretty good player. It was a bummer he was injured all year. I think he was kind of in line to have a big role in Dallas. And so I think he's a good NBA player now. He'll be a nice third guard. Like I said, Stauskas just doesn't make sense. I think there are better options out there. I don't think he was the guy I would have wanted to sign. I would have rather just retained Pat Connaughton. But uneventful is the best way to describe it. I'm having trouble really thinking of deep analysis just because I'm kind of indifferent to it. I mean, it is what it is. Olshey knows he didn't really have the cap space to do a lot, and so he's preaching like, well, we won 49 games last year, like we were the 3 seed, like let's just run it back. And I think a lot of people understand that's not really the way we should be looking at it. And so just not a lot of opinions on it, just because I think it is what it is. They signed a couple guys. They drafted a couple guys. If one of them or one and a half of them is a positive contributor this year, that'll be a win in terms of draft/free agent acquisition. So not a lot of optimism radiating from the Blazers offseason, especially when you look at it in terms of what the rest of the Western Conference playoff contenders did.
Yeah, I was actually with Mike out in Greece when you made the Seth Curry signing. And he just shrugged. Like he had nothing to say on the signing. We'll talk about your draft pick now. Anthony Simons. have you got anything to say on that one? Because I'll be honest, he was one of the guys taken in the first round that unfortunately I did not have very well-rounded notes on. He just wasn't someone I had time to look at. Have you done much looking at him since, or did you have any opinions at the time?
No, I'm in the same boat. I did a lot of draft work for 2 or 3 months or so, maybe a little less than that. But I had a lot of guys that I was honed in on, and when the Blazers drafted him, I got a lot of people asking me about him, and I didn't really have anything to say because I hadn't watched a single minute of his film. I've read some scouting reports. I know kind of the consensus on him was talented guy, good athlete, really raw. And I watched a little bit of the Blazers Summer League, and he was definitely a nice surprise. So I would say I'm more encouraged after watching Summer League. I still don't necessarily get the draft pick itself. We have two guys in their prime right now, and you had a glaring hole on the wing, and you went for a long-term project at guard that isn't really going to probably give you a lot of high-level impact during Lillard and McCollum's prime. So it's a frustrating pick. It's nothing against Simons. I hope he's a really talented player and makes an impact at some point. But yeah, I liked his shot making and his ability to kind of create off the bounce in Summer League. Obviously, have to take all of that with a grain of salt. And I haven't really watched a ton of his film prior to Summer League, but what I saw there I liked. But obviously, it's tough to envision him having a huge role in maybe this next year or two.
Neil Olshey really needs next year. He needs to, when we do this again, hopefully, he needs to sign players who you can have strong opinions on.
Yeah. He just needs to sign. He just needs to sign players, sign a wing, sign a guy who can hit threes or something. But yeah, it was just a weird offseason that doesn't leave a lot of hope for this upcoming year when you look at a lot of the pieces that other West teams landed are returning.
Yeah, and I think that lack of hope, that seems like a good way to transition into sort of the final section, which is a look at next season. So I'm very active on Twitter. I'm too active on Twitter, really. But I saw you tweet the other day that you have Portland and Minnesota out of the playoffs. I'm going to ignore your Minnesota prediction, but I'm going to talk about your Portland one. I also have you out of it. I think I've got Denver coming in quite comfortably. I've got someone else coming in as well.
Probably, I'd imagine you have the Lakers in there.
Oh yeah, I do. I have the Lakers as the 8, so I think I've got Portland out. I'm not sure of the other team I've got out. Pelicans.
That whole I just don't. I mean, I think Portland's a logical pick, and I say Minnesota, but I'm not gonna go to war for that pick. I could honestly see pretty much any of the other 3 through 8 teams dropping out for the most part. Maybe not OKC, maybe not Utah, but I don't think there's any locks. And whoever you say you don't think is going to make the playoffs is probably a valid reason. You probably have fair reasons. I don't think maybe not OKC and Utah. I think those are probably near locks. But beyond that, there's a lot of good reasons. In Minnesota, it's just I'm probably just banking on something happening in terms of a trade or whatnot. But I think something really make a lot of sense. Yeah, it's just a guess. It's just so tough to predict who else isn't going to make it because there's reasons for him and there's reasons against him. So that's just me really taking a stab in the dark.
Your Blazers one, would you more go to war with that one than the sort of Minnesota one, or are you the same on that one? It's more like you're not sure.
No. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I would go to war. But I'm definitely a little more confident in that pick. You look at the injury luck they had. Nurkic has missed a lot of time in his career over the first 3 or 4 years, and he barely missed any time. Lillard was healthy. Al-Farouq Aminu was healthy. A lot of healthy guys there. And then you look, they lost Shabazz Napier. They lost Ed Davis. They lost Pat Connaughton, excuse me. If they lost Aminu, they'd be in serious trouble. But yeah, I mean, you look at the teams that around them that had a lot of bad injury luck, whereas the Blazers had good injury luck, and they lost a lot of their depth. I could go on and on about why not re-signing Ed Davis was a bad decision, but he was a really important guy off the bench and a guy who was really well liked in the locker room with a veteran presence. I think when your 2 best players in McCollum and Lillard actively voiced their displeasure with letting him go elsewhere on Twitter, you probably did something wrong. And I don't think that's just because they liked getting drinks or getting dinner with him or having him in the locker room. I think it's because they genuinely, I should say, understood the high level impact he had as a big man off the bench. I think he was really important for Zach Collins' development. They're a pretty good 2-man pairing, if I recall, based off the numbers. So I think the depth they lost, the injury luck they had, and the fact they still were only the 3 seed by a game. When you couple that with the return of guys like Paul Millsap, Jimmy Butler, Andre Roberson, an all-star. They're basically at an all-star if you say Kawhi didn't really do much for him last year. Gobert is probably going to be healthy for the whole year. Donovan Mitchell's going to take a step forward. The Pelicans signed Julius Randle, and they seem to kind of find a new identity without DeMarcus Cousins. So I think there's a lot of valid reasons to say they're not going to make the playoffs, but at the same time, it's tough to count on a team led by Lillard and Terry Stotts because they've generally shown the ability to get the most out of their players and rise to the occasion. So I think if you think they're going to make the playoffs again, it's probably just based off recent history, which is totally valid because they've shown the ability to kind of pull a rabbit out of their hat despite limited rosters.
Yeah, I certainly think longevity is a big reason to put the Blazers in. I've got you outside. It's close, though. I mean, I've seen some that have sort of Dallas and Memphis above you. I don't think I'd go that far, certainly not with Dallas. I think there's just too much to do for Dallas.
Yeah, Memphis is a really sneaky pick. I think it's kind of becoming a trendy pick nowadays. But I like what they did this offseason. I really do. You basically have to bank on health of Conley and Gasol, which is maybe not Gasol, but more Conley, but Gasol staying engaged because he definitely took a step back last year. Whether or not that was really due to age or just lack of engagement because of their tanking ways is yet to be seen. But I think Memphis is a really interesting team. Michael Pina of Vice wrote an interesting piece about them and how I think the title was like they're the most intriguing team in the league. And while I don't necessarily think that's the case, they are a really interesting case because there's a lot of things that go right for them, and there's also a lot of things that go wrong for Memphis. And so they're a team that could be really fun, or they could be really miserable again. But I could see Memphis making the playoffs if their guys stay healthy and Conley's back to kind of being a fringe all-star again.
Yeah, they should have 48 minutes of one elite big man defender, albeit they've got very different defensive skill sets, Gasol and Jaren Jackson. But put it this way, the Blazers, I think people are underrating them, but this is probably, I think, going to be Stotts' toughest test yet. And final question I want to ask you is, let's say it does go wrong, you miss the playoffs. It's obviously you're not a psychic, but do you think there would be a lot of change, or do you think Olshey would kind of be more inclined to run it back again and sort of tinker rather than overhaul things?
I think he'll be generally more inclined to tinker things. He's shown a desire to stay relevant, even when they traded those guys, or when they did that kind of that overhaul back when Aldridge left. They didn't really have a lot of choice. Their best player at the time had left. Wesley Matthews was coming off a serious Achilles injury, so there was a lot of risk in bringing him back. They traded for a young big man, traded Batum away, and I think their hand was kind of forced there. So I generally believe they'll try and bring it back, but a lot of it also stems from how the season goes, because if Olshey is able to kind of, for lack of a better phrase, like spin a narrative that they could run it back and be a 3 or 4 seed, then I imagine they'll do that. But if everyone's healthy and they just win like 42 games and miss the playoffs by 4 games, then you have some issues. So I don't think they're going to lose 7 more games. I'd probably have them 45 range. I don't have that as the playoffs because the West can be so deep and talented this year. But I would bet on them running it back, because by then it would only be 1 year away until they can get off those contracts, and so hopefully be able to sign some more talent and more fitting talent around Lillard and maybe McCollum. So I would doubt they blow it up just because it hasn't really been in Olshey's nature when he's had the opportunity to do so.
Well, I've enjoyed having your thoughts on the Blazers. Thanks for coming on. It's been good to have you. Yeah, this will go down well with our fans. We have a lot of Blazers listeners in the UK.
Yeah, I know it's been fun. I don't get to talk about the Blazers a lot just because it's not really my domain as a writer right now. But maybe I'm a little bit too pessimistic. They've proven to kind of find a way no matter the context and situation. So obviously I will be rooting for them to make it. I've been a fan of the Blazers since I was 7 years old or 6 years old, and so I'm not abandoning hope, but I just generally want to take a little bit more measured of approach and not expect them to come close to 50 wins again and be let down. So they could make the playoffs. I wouldn't be shocked if they were a 6 seed or something and just kind of found a way to scrap and claw their way to wins. I certainly hope that's the case, but there's a lot of signs that just don't necessarily point that to being the case. But Lillard and Stotts have proven, and McCollum have proven what the on paper record or talent might suggest. So that could certainly be the case again.
Yeah, I'm going to obviously be rooting against you because we're in the same division. Again, thank you for coming on. It's goodbye from me. It's goodbye from Jack.
All right, thanks, Joe.